In the autumn of 1958, a 16-year-old boy named Ted Kaczynski arrived at the gates of Harvard University. He was a skinny kid with a shy demeanor and an intellect that moved at a speed most people couldn't comprehend. While his peers were preoccupied with the social hierarchies of the Ivy League, Ted was a ghost in the hallways of Sherman Hall. He had skipped several grades, which meant he was socially adrift among older students who viewed him as an oddity. He spent his nights in the library, diving into the most abstract branches of mathematics, seeking a kind of order that the chaotic world of human emotion couldn't provide. His professors recognized his genius immediately, but they also noticed a profound wall he built around himself. He didn't participate in the typical collegiate rituals of the late 50s. He didn't go to dances or join clubs. He simply existed in a world of numbers and proofs, a solitary figure moving through a crowded campus. During his sophomore year, Ted's life took a dark and permanent detour. He volunteered for a psychological study led by Dr. Henry Murray, a man who had worked for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. Murray was interested in the limits of human ego and the effects of high-stress interrogation. Ted thought he was signing up for a series of intellectual debates about his personal philosophy. Instead, he was subjected to a brutal form of psychological breaking. He was placed in a windowless room, his physiological responses monitored by cold, clicking machines, while a law student sat across from him and systematically dismantled Ted's most cherished beliefs. They mocked his background, his intelligence, and his very existence in hours-long sessions designed to induce maximum humiliation. He began to associate the scientific method and modern technology with the degradation of the human spirit. By the time Ted graduated and moved on to the University of Michigan for his master's and PhD, he was a changed man. He was still a mathematical titan, solving problems that had baffled experts for decades. But he was becoming increasingly paranoid about the direction of society. He viewed the growing presence of computers and automated systems as a looming prison. He finished his dissertation so quickly and with such brilliance that his thesis committee noted it was likely the best they had ever seen. He was offered a prestigious position at the University of California, Berkeley, becoming the youngest assistant professor in the school's history. On paper, he was a success story of the highest order. He had reached the pinnacle of academia by the age of 25. But inside the bustling environment of the late 60s Berkeley campus, Ted felt like he was suffocating. He looked at the massive mainframes being wheeled into the engineering buildings and saw them as the harbingers of a global catastrophe. In 1969, without any warning or explanation, Ted walked into the dean's office and resigned. His colleagues were stunned. They tried to convince him to stay, offering him tenure and more research funding. But Ted had already made up his mind. He didn't want to be part of the machine anymore. He withdrew his life savings, which amounted to a few $1,000s, and began looking for a way to disappear. He didn't tell his parents or his brother, David, where he was going. He just drove north, eventually crossing the border into Montana. He was looking for a place where the sound of an engine couldn't reach him. He found a small, 4-acre plot of land in the town of Lincoln, nestled in the shadows of the Continental Divide. It was a rugged, unforgiving landscape filled with dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings. It was exactly what he was looking for. Ted spent the summer of 1971 building a 10 by 12-foot wooden cabin with his own hands. It was a primitive structure with no electricity, no running water, and no insulation. He lived on a diet of wild game, foraging for berries, and growing a small garden in the rocky soil. For the first few years, he lived the life of a true hermit. He spent his days mapping the surrounding wilderness and learning how to survive the brutal Montana winters, where temperatures often dropped to 40 degrees below zero. He kept a meticulous journal, written in a complex secret code he invented, detailing his thoughts on nature and his growing hatred for industrial civilization. He believed he had finally found a way to live outside the reach of the modern world. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since his childhood in Illinois. But the world wouldn't leave him alone. As the 70s progressed, the logging industry began to expand into the Lincoln area. Ted would go on long hikes to his favorite secluded spots, only to find them leveled by clear cutting operations. One afternoon, he arrived at a plateau he considered his sacred place, a spot where he went to meditate and feel a connection to the earth. He found it crisscrossed with new roads and littered with the debris of construction crews. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and the sound of birds, was now thick with the smell of diesel and the high-pitched whine of chainsaws. This was the moment of no return. Ted realized that there was no way to go to. As long as the technological system existed, it would eventually find every corner of the planet and destroy it. He decided that if he couldn't hide from the system, he would have to fight it. His first acts of rebellion were small. He would sneak onto construction sites at night and sabotage the equipment. He poured sand into the oil tanks of bulldozers and used a hacksaw to cut through hydraulic lines. He even strung up thin wires across trails used by motorcycle riders, hoping to cause injuries. But these actions felt insignificant to him. The machines always came back, and the trees kept falling. He realized that to truly hurt the system, he had to target the people who were its architects, the scientists, the engineers, and the corporate executives. He returned to his cabin and began a new kind of study. He spent months researching chemistry and ballistics using old books he found in the Lincoln Public Library. He didn't want to buy any components that could be traced back to him, so he decided to build his bombs entirely from scratch. He used scrap metal he found at the local dump and hand-carved his own wooden trigger mechanisms. He spent hundreds of hours polishing tiny pieces of wood and metal until they fit together with the precision of a Swiss watch. He worked by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, his hands stained with chemicals and grease. He was obsessed with making sure his devices left no forensic evidence. He didn't use commercial explosives. Instead, he mixed his own gunpowder from raw materials. He even made his own glue from boiled hooves and hides. By the spring of 1978, he was ready. He packed his first device into a handmade wooden box and took a bus out of Montana, heading toward the Midwest. He was no longer just a hermit in the woods. He had become a professional hunter of men. On May 25, 1978, a package was found in a parking lot at the University of Chicago. It was addressed to an engineering professor at another school, but the return address listed a faculty member at Northwestern University. This was a classic return-to-sender ruse. When the package was delivered to Northwestern, a security officer named Terry Marker was tasked with opening it. As he pulled back the lid of the wooden box, a small but violent explosion occurred. The blast sent splinters of wood and metal into Marker's hand and chest. It wasn't a lethal device, but the craftsmanship was chilling. The FBI was called in, and they were immediately struck by how unusual the bomb was. There were no fingerprints, no store-bought parts, and the explosives were a unique homemade blend. It was the birth of a mystery that would consume the Bureau for the next 18 years. A year later, another bomb appeared at Northwestern, this time in a graduate student's mail. The victim, John Harris, suffered minor burns and cuts when the device detonated. The bomber was gaining confidence. The FBI established a small task force under the code name Unabomber, which stood for University and Airline Bomber. They had no suspects and no clear motive other than a general targeting of technical institutions. The lead investigator at the time noted that the bomber seemed to have an obsession with wood. Every component that could be made from wood was carefully shaped and polished. It was as if the bomber was trying to send a message about the natural world, even through his acts of violence. But the investigators couldn't imagine that this was anything more than a disgruntled student or a low-level eccentric. Everything changed in November of 1979. Ted decided to escalate his campaign to a level that could have resulted in mass casualties. He managed to sneak a large package into the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444, a Boeing 727 flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C. This wasn't a standard pipe bomb. It was a sophisticated incendiary device equipped with an atmosphere pressure sensor. The plan was simple and horrific. Once the plane reached a certain altitude, the change in pressure would trigger the device, causing a massive fire in the hold that would likely bring the plane down. Mid-flight, the passengers and crew were suddenly overwhelmed by a thick, acrid smoke filling the cabin. The pilots declared an emergency when the cargo hold was opened. Investigators found a smoldering mess. The bomb had malfunctioned, failing to explode, but starting a chemical fire that had filled the aircraft with toxic fumes. If the device had functioned as intended, 78 people would have died in a mid-air disaster. The FBI realized they were no longer dealing with a nuisance. They were dealing with a high-level domestic terrorist. The case was moved to the top of the priority list. They began looking for anyone with a background in aviation or high-level physics, but they were looking in the wrong places. Ted was already back in his cabin in Montana, sitting in the dark, listening to the news on a battery-operated radio. He was disappointed the plane hadn't crashed, but he was encouraged by the panic he had caused. He began working on a new design, one that would be more reliable and far more deadly. In the early 1980s, the bombs became more powerful and more frequent. In 1982, a secretary at Vanderbilt University opened a package that sent her to the hospital with severe injuries. A few weeks later, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, was maimed by a device left in a common room. The FBI was pouring millions into the investigation, but they were chasing a ghost. Ted never stayed in one place. He would take multiple buses across several states just to mail a single package, often wearing a disguise and gloves the entire time. He was meticulous about his sterile lifestyle. He didn't have a phone, he didn't have a car, and he didn't have any friends. He was a man who had completely erased his footprint from society. The laboratory technicians at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. were baffled by the physical evidence. When they deconstructed the fragments of the Vanderbilt University device, they found that even the tiniest screws had been modified. The bomber was using a metal lathe to shave off any identifying marks or serial numbers from the components. He wasn't just building bombs. He was performing a meticulous erasure of his own existence. Investigators began to notice a pattern in the materials that defied explanation. Much of the hardware came from literal trash. He was using old pipes, scraps of aluminum, and even wood from discarded furniture. This made it impossible to track the origin of the materials. Usually, a pipe bomb is made from a galvanized steel pipe bought at a place like Home Depot, which has a specific threading pattern. This man was casting his own parts. He was melting down lead and pouring it into handmade molds in the middle of the wilderness. The level of effort required to do this was staggering. It suggested a person with an infinite amount of time and a pathological dedication to his mission. The FBI started to build a profile of a man who likely lived alone, had a background in hard sciences, and possessed a deep-seated grudge against the very institutions that had educated him. The psychological toll on the academic community was immense. Professors at major research universities began to look at their morning mail with a sense of genuine dread. At UC Berkeley, the atmosphere was particularly thick with tension. Diogenes Angelikos, a respected professor of electrical engineering, walked into a faculty common room on a Tuesday afternoon and saw a small, unassuming wooden box on a table. Thinking it belonged to a colleague, he moved to pick it up. The resulting blast didn't just injure him. It sent a shockwave through the entire campus. The Unabomber task force was growing, but it was also spinning its wheels. They were looking for a disgruntled worker or a failed academic, but they couldn't find anyone who fit the bill and had also disappeared from society. They looked at thousands of people who had been fired from tech companies or denied tenure at universities. But because Ted had resigned so cleanly and moved so far away into the deep woods of Montana, he wasn't even on their radar. He was a ghost living in a 10 by 12-foot wooden box. Thousands of miles away from the cities he was terrorizing. He was living on less than a few $100s a year, surviving on rabbits and parsnips, while the United States government spent millions of dollars trying to find him. In late 1985, the nature of the attacks changed. Up until this point, the bombs had been designed to maim and intimidate, but they hadn't yet caused a fatality. That changed in a parking lot in Sacramento, California. Hugh Scruton was a 38-year-old business owner who ran a computer rental shop. He was exactly the kind of person Ted Kaczynski loathed, someone who made a living by facilitating the spread of technology into the hands of the general public. When Hugh walked out to his car and saw a strange object near his tire, He did what any responsible person would do. He tried to move it so no one would get flat. The explosion was so violent that it was heard blocks away. It wasn't just a pipe bomb. It was a sophisticated device designed for maximum lethality. The death of Hugh Scruton changed the rules of the game. The FBI realized that the bomber was no longer interested in just sending a message. He was now actively seeking to eliminate people he deemed guilty of participating in the technological system. The task force was flooded with new resources. They began analyzing the wooden components of the Sacramento bomb with high-power microscopes. They discovered that the wood wasn't just any wood. It was often handcrafted from several different types of trees, including cherry and maple, polished to a high sheen. This was a bizarre detail. Why would a killer spend hours polishing a piece of wood that was designed to be blown into 1,000 pieces? It suggested a man who viewed his work as a form of dark art, a craftsman who took pride in the beauty of his instruments of death. As 1986 turned into 1987, the pressure on the FBI reached a breaking point. The public was demanding answers, and the media was beginning to criticize the Bureau for its lack of progress. The investigators were desperate for a break, and they finally got one in Salt Lake City. A woman working in an office building looked out her window and saw a man in the parking lot. He was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, but the hood was up, and he was wearing large, reflective aviator sunglasses. He looked out of place, moving with a deliberate, stiff gait. He placed an object behind the wheel of the car and walked away without looking back. She didn't know it yet, but she was looking at the most wanted man in the world. When the device exploded moments later, the witness gave a detailed description to a sketch artist. This resulted in the famous hoodie and sunglasses drawing. It was a double-edged sword for the investigation. On one hand, it gave the public a face to look for. On the other hand, it was so generic that it led to tens of thousands of false tips. Every man in America who owned a gray sweatshirt and liked to hike was suddenly a suspect. But for Ted, seeing his own likeness on the cover of Time magazine was a terrifying moment of clarity. He realized that his invisibility had been compromised. He retreated even further into the Montana wilderness, deciding to go dormant. For the next 6 years, the mail remained safe and the bombs stopped coming. But the silence wasn't a sign of peace, it was a sign of evolution. During the years of 1987 to 1993, the world changed rapidly. The internet began to take shape, personal computers became a household staple, and the technological system Ted hated was expanding at an exponential rate. From his cabin in Lincoln, Ted watched this progression through the newspapers he occasionally picked up in town. He saw his worst nightmares coming true. The machines were becoming more integrated into human life than ever before. He spent these years in a state of intense intellectual fermentation. He wasn't just sitting in the woods. He was writing. He was drafting what would eventually become his 35,000-word manifesto, a philosophical justification for his crimes. He also used this time to solve a technical problem that had plagued his earlier bombs: reliability. Some of his early devices had failed to detonate or had only partially exploded. He wanted his next campaign to be flawless. He spent months studying metallurgy, learning how to create his own custom threaded bolts and high-performance triggers. He was living a dual life. To the people in Lincoln, he was Hermit Ted, a strange but mostly harmless guy who rode an old bicycle and lived in a shack without a toilet. To himself, he was a revolutionary soldier at war with the future. He would spend all day in the library in town, taking meticulous notes on chemistry and engineering, then go back to his cabin and apply those notes to the construction of a new generation of explosives. The FBI, meanwhile, was losing hope. The Unabomber task force had been scaled back to a skeleton crew. Many agents believed the bomber had died or moved on to another country. The case was becoming a cold case, a legendary mystery that was taught in training seminars but wasn't expected to be solved. They had no idea that the suspect was currently living in a cabin that was clearly visible from the road, just a few miles from a busy national forest. Ted's ability to hide in plain sight was his greatest weapon. He didn't look like a terrorist. He looked like a man who had simply been left behind by the 20th century. He was a relic of a different time and that was exactly why no one suspected him. In June of 1993, the silence was broken with a terrifying level of precision. 2 bombs were delivered on consecutive days to 2 of the most brilliant minds in their respective fields. The first went to David Gelernter, a computer science professor at Yale, and the second went to Charles Epstein, a renowned geneticist. Both men survived, but they were permanently changed. The bombs were much more powerful than the 1980s models. They were designed to destroy entire offices. The Phantom was back, and he was angrier than ever. The FBI immediately ramped the task force back up to its highest level, but they were starting from zero. They had a 6-year gap in evidence and a killer who had apparently used that time to become a master of his craft. The 1993 bombings were accompanied by something new: letters. Ted began writing to the New York Times, identifying himself as part of a group called FC, which stood for Freedom Club. He claimed that he was part of a larger organization dedicated to the destruction of the industrial technological system. This was a classic tactical move to make himself seem more formidable and to divert attention away from the idea of a single lone wolf. The letters were arrogant, intelligent, and chillingly logical. He told the FBI that if they wanted the bombings to stop, they would have to listen to him. He was no longer content with just killing. He wanted to change the course of human history. The FBI brought in world-class linguists to analyze the letters. They looked for regional dialects, specific academic jargon, and even the way the letters were spaced on the page. They realized that the author was likely someone who had been educated in the 1950s or 60s, given his use of certain outdated idioms. But even with the best minds in the country working on it, they couldn't narrow it down to a specific person. There were hundreds of thousands of people who fit that general description. The investigation was a massive haystack, and they were looking for a needle that didn't even want to be found. In 1994, the violence claimed its second victim. Thomas Mosser, an executive at a top-tier advertising and PR firm, was at home with his family in New Jersey when he opened a package that had been mailed to him. The device was so powerful it tore through the kitchen and killed him instantly. Ted targeted Mosser because he believed the man's firm was responsible for manipulating the public into accepting the technological status quo. It was a cold-blooded assassination of a man who was simply doing his job. The level of fear in the corporate and academic worlds reached a fever pitch. People were afraid to touch their mail. Companies started installing expensive X-ray machines in their mailrooms. The Unabomber had successfully held the entire country hostage. The final murder occurred in April of 1995. Gilbert Murray, the president of the California Forestry Association, was killed in his office in Sacramento. This was a return to the scene of Ted's first fatal bombing 10 years earlier. It was a grim full circle. Shortly after the Murray bombing, Ted sent his ultimatum. He sent a massive manuscript to the Washington Post and the New York Times. He told them that if they published his manifesto in its entirety, he would permanently cease all terrorist activities. It was a demand that put the United States government in an impossible position. If they refused, more people would die. If they complied, they were giving a platform to a mass murderer. The debate over whether to publish the manifesto went all the way to the Oval Office. The director of the FBI and the Attorney General met with the publishers of the newspapers. The journalists were concerned about the ethics of printing a terrorist's work, but the FBI argued that it was their best, and perhaps only, chance to catch him. They hoped that the document's very specific ideas and writing style would be recognized by someone who knew the author. They were betting that the Unabomber's ego, his desire to be understood, would be his downfall. On September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published the 35,000-word document as a special supplement. The manifesto was a dense, rambling, but often highly articulate critique of modern society. It touched on everything from psychology to history to physics. Millions of people read it. Most saw it as the work of a madman, but some found the logic strangely compelling, even if they abhorred the violence. In a small town in upstate New York, David Kaczynski and his wife Linda sat down to read it. They had been worried about Ted for years. He had become increasingly erratic in his letters to them. expressing a deep hatred for his parents and for the world in general. Linda was the first to notice the similarities. She told David, "This sounds like your brother." David didn't want to believe it. He remembered Ted as the brilliant older brother who had taught him about nature and science. But as he went through the manifesto, he saw specific phrases that he remembered from his childhood. He saw the way the author obsessed over the same themes that Ted had ranted about in his private letters. The realization was agonizing. David spent weeks in a state of paralysis, torn between his loyalty to his brother and his responsibility to the innocent people who might be next. He finally decided that he couldn't live with the blood on his hands. He hired a private investigator to act as a go-between, and eventually, the information made its way to the Unabomber task force. The FBI took the tip seriously, but they had to be careful. They didn't want to alert Ted. They sent a small team to Lincoln, Montana, to conduct surveillance. They saw a man who looked like a wild animal. He was unkempt, his clothes were rags, and his skin was dark with soot from his wood stove. He lived in a shack that was barely larger than a prison cell. It seemed impossible that this man, who lived without a phone or a car, could be the mastermind behind a 20-year campaign of high-tech terror. But when they checked his records and saw his background in mathematics and his history at Berkeley, the pieces began to fit together with terrifying precision. On April 3rd, 1996, the FBI decided it was time to move. They knew Ted was armed and that his cabin was likely booby-trapped. They didn't want a shootout or a standoff that could lead to his suicide. They used a clever ruse, sending a local forest ranger to the cabin door. The ranger told Ted that they were having a dispute about the property lines and needed him to come outside and look at a map. Ted, ever the stickler for rules and boundaries, stepped out onto the porch. As soon as he did, two agents who had been hiding around the corner grabbed him. He was a small man, weighing barely 140 pounds, and he was easily overwhelmed. As they took him away, other agents began the task of searching the cabin. What they found inside was a physical representation of a shattered mind. Every inch of the space was filled with stuff. There were thousands of pages of handwritten notes, most of them in code. There were jars of chemicals, piles of scrap metal, and, most chillingly, a fully constructed bomb under his bed, addressed and ready to be mailed. It was a time capsule of hate. They found the original typewriter he had used for the manifesto and the gray sweatshirt from the 1987 sketch. There was no doubt anymore. The 18-year hunt was over. The trial was a media circus, but it never actually went to a full jury. Ted's lawyers wanted to use an insanity defense, arguing that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Ted, however, hated the idea of being labeled insane. He believed his ideas were perfectly logical and that he was a rational actor fighting a legitimate war. He attempted to fire his lawyers and even try to hang himself in his cell. Eventually, he agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 8 life terms without the possibility of parole. Ted Kaczynski spent the rest of his life in the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. He was housed in a small cell, similar in size to his cabin in Montana, but made of concrete and steel instead of wood. He continued to write letters to people all over the world, becoming a cult figure for some radical environmental groups. He died in June of 2023 at the age of 81. He had wanted to save the world from technology by using the very tools of destruction that technology provided. In the end, he became exactly what he feared, a component in a system that had categorized him, studied him, and eventually locked him away forever. If you lived in Anchorage, Alaska, back in 2012, there's a good chance you would have run into a man named Israel Keys. He was 34 years old, a veteran of the U.S. Army, and by all accounts, a master at his craft. He was a self-employed carpenter, and if you needed a deck built or a kitchen remodeled, Israel was the guy you called. He was quiet, he was professional, and he stayed out of everyone's business. Neighbors would see him every morning taking his young daughter to school, looking like every other dedicated father in the neighborhood. In a place like Alaska, where people really value their privacy and their independence, Israel fit right in. He was the kind of person who was just there, part of the scenery. Now, most people who do the kinds of things Israel was doing, they have a pattern. Usually, they have a type of person they target, or maybe a specific neighborhood they keep going back to. It's almost like they have a comfort zone. But Israel didn't. He didn't hunt people. He hunted for the perfect moment. For over a decade, he was essentially a ghost moving through the lower 48. He would fly from Anchorage to a massive airport like O'Hare in Chicago or Hobby in Houston, rent a generic car, and then just drive. He would go for thousands of miles, crossing 5 or 6 state lines, into places where he didn't know a soul. He never used a cell phone, he never used a credit card, and he never targeted anyone he had even a remote connection to. But there was something else, something that made him different from almost any other predator the FBI had ever tracked. Long before he ever chose a victim, Israel would go on what he called vacations. He would hike into remote state parks, walk through old, overgrown cemeteries, or find quiet trailheads in states he hadn't even worked in yet. Once he found a spot that felt truly isolated, he would dig. He would bury these ordinary orange Home Depot buckets deep in the dirt and seal the lids tight. Inside, he packed everything he'd eventually need: weapons, silencers, zip ties, and tools for disposal. He'd even stashed thousands of dollars in cash he'd stolen from bank robberies just to fund his future trips. He would leave those buckets there for years. That way, if he ever got pulled over while traveling, his car was completely clean. He was playing a game of chess against the world, and for 10 years, nobody even knew it was his turn. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet corner of New England that had never even heard his name, Israel's long-term planning was about to become a reality. It was June of 2011, and Israel had just finished a 2-day drive from Chicago to the green hills of Essex, Vermont. He didn't have a map with a red circle on it. He didn't have a name. He just had a mental checklist. For several nights, he lived out of his rental car, slowly trolling through middle-class neighborhoods after midnight. He was looking for a very specific house. It needed an attached garage so he could get inside without any neighbors seeing him. It couldn't have a dog that might bark, and he didn't want any children around. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for a tactical advantage. Eventually, he found a modest home on Susquehanna Court. This was the home of Bill and Lorraine Currier. They were hardworking, well-liked people who had lived in Essex for years. Bill worked at the local university, and Lorraine worked in healthcare. They felt so safe in their community that they'd sometimes leave the garage door unlocked just to let the summer air circulate through the house. Israel watched them from the shadows of the tree line, sitting perfectly still, timing exactly when their bedroom lights went out. On the night of June 8th, he drove to a patch of woods nearby and retrieved a shovel. He dug up a Home Depot bucket he had buried 2 years earlier, checked his suppressed handgun and his zip ties, and prepared himself. He moved toward the house on foot, navigating the backyard with the silent precision of a soldier. He cut the phone lines first, and then he stepped into the garage. Inside the dark house, Israel moved through the hallways with a tactical flashlight and a weapon. He reached the upstairs bedroom and kicked the door open, catching Bill and Lorraine in a deep sleep. Before they could even process the fact that a stranger was in their room, Israel had them blinded by a high-powered light. He spoke to them in a terrifyingly calm, almost polite voice, telling them that if they just complied, they would be okay. He used the zip ties to bind their wrists and force them into their own car. He didn't want to finish this in a neighborhood where someone might wake up. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse he had found during his scouting trips, a massive, decaying ruin slated for demolition, hidden behind layers of overgrown brush. Inside that freezing, hollow building, the Kayas realized that their compliance wasn't going to save them. Israel led Bill to the basement first. Bill tried to fight back, but Israel was younger, stronger, and he had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Once Bill was gone, Israel went back upstairs for Lorraine. He later admitted that he spent hours in that farmhouse, maintaining that same calm, clinical demeanor even as the situation turned into a nightmare. When the sun began to rise, he finished the job. He then used the tools from his kit to hide the remains deep under the debris of the farmhouse, spending hours scrubbing every surface with bleach. He abandoned their car at a nearby apartment complex, walked away, and flew back to Alaska the next day. In Vermont, The search for the Kayyas became a national mystery, but with no forensic evidence and no motive, the case went cold almost instantly. By the beginning of 2012, Israel Keyes had been operating in the shadows for over a decade, and that success had given him a dangerous sense of invincibility. He decided to break his own golden rule. He decided to hunt in the city where he lived. On the night of February 1st, the temperature in Anchorage was dropping well below zero and the wind was picking up. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was finishing her shift at Common Grounds, a tiny coffee shack sitting in the middle of a dark parking lot. It was a vulnerable, isolated glass box. Israel had been sitting in his car across the street for nearly an hour, watching her through binoculars. He knew she was alone. At around 8 p.m., just as she was turning off the lights to close, he walked up to the window. He looked like any other customer in a heavy parka. When Samantha opened the window to tell him they were closed, he produced a handgun. The security footage from inside the shack shows the exact moment the trap closed. Samantha's hands went up. Her expression shifted to pure shock, and within seconds, Israel had vaulted through the small window with terrifying agility. He forced her out the back door and into his vehicle, which he had parked in a dark corner of the lot. He didn't take her to a remote forest this time. He took her back to his own property, to a small, blue tool shed just feet away from the house where his girlfriend and daughter were sleeping. He tied her to a chair, and for the first time in his life, he began to lose his cool. He had originally planned to keep her alive for weeks to negotiate a $30,000 ransom. But Samantha wasn't a passive victim. She fought him, she challenged him, and she forced him to realize he wasn't as in control as he thought he was. In a fit of frustration, he abandoned his plan and ended her life that same night. But he still wanted the money. The problem was that he had a family vacation already booked, a luxury cruise to Mexico. If he stayed behind or acted strange, his girlfriend would become suspicious. So, Israel did something truly macabre. He left Samantha in the tool shed. Because of the Alaskan winter, the shed acted as a natural freezer. He locked the door, packed his bags, and boarded a plane. For 2 weeks, he was the picture-perfect tourist, taking photos of the sunset and eating at the buffet, all while knowing a young woman was frozen in his shed back home. When he returned from the cruise, he went straight back to the shed to finalize the ransom. He knew he needed a proof-of-life photo to convince the family she was still alive. He took Samantha's frozen body and sat her up. He applied makeup to her face to hide the grayness of her skin and give her a flush of color. In a detail that would later haunt the investigators, he used a needle and clear fishing line to sew her eyelids open, so she would appear to be awake and staring at the camera. He placed a newspaper from that morning in her lap to verify the date and took a Polaroid photo. He dropped the photo and a ransom note at a local park, instructing the family to deposit $30,000 into her bank account. The family, seeing the photo and believing Samantha was staring back at them, desperately complied. They scrambled to find the money and deposited it immediately. Israel began making withdrawals at ATMs across the city, convinced he was still invisible. But by hunting in his own backyard, he had finally stepped into a spotlight he couldn't escape. The moment the first dollar was withdrawn from Samantha's account, a digital dragnet was activated thousands of miles away. The FBI and the Anchorage Police Department were monitoring that debit card in real time. They weren't just waiting for pings, they were mapping the speed and direction of the user. The first withdrawal happened in Arizona, then another in New Mexico. It was clear the suspect was moving east along Interstate 10. The FBI coordinated with state troopers across the South, providing a description of a lone male in a rental car. On March 13, 2012, in Lufkin, Texas, a veteran Texas Ranger named Brian Washburn spotted a white Ford Focus in a hotel parking lot. He noticed it was parked in a combat park position, backed in for a quick getaway. He ran the plates and confirmed it was a rental out of Arizona. The Ranger set up a surveillance point and waited. After 20 minutes, a man walked out of the hotel, got into the car, and headed toward the highway. Ranger Washburn followed, waiting for a minor traffic violation to pull him over. When the driver failed to signal a turn, the lights went on. The man who pulled over was Israel Keyes. He was calm, soft-spoken, and incredibly polite. He handed over his Alaska license, and explained he was just on a road trip. But the ranger noticed a crumpled map on the floorboard and rolls of cash in the console. When he asked to search the car, Israel, still confident in his ability to deceive, gave his consent. He believed he had cleaned the vehicle perfectly, but as the ranger checked the side pocket of the driver's door, his fingers brushed against a small plastic card. He pulled it out and read the name, Samantha Koenig. The atmosphere in that interrogation room in Lufkin was tense. Israel initially tried to claim he had found the card in a parking lot, but the FBI team that flew in from Alaska wasn't buying it. They sat across from him and laid out the evidence: the security footage, the DNA from his shed, and the logs from the cruise ship. They watched as Israel's calm exterior finally began to crack. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man in a small room with no way out. He stopped the polite contractor act, leaned in, and told them he would talk, but only on his terms. He wanted the death penalty, and he didn't want his daughter to know what he was. Once he realized the game was over, his ego took over. He didn't show remorse. He showed pride. He began to describe a decade of horror that far exceeded anything the authorities had suspected. He told them about the Cayes in Vermont, bank robberies in New York, and the kill kits buried across the country. He spoke with a chilling level of detachment, explaining how he had hunted people like animals and outsmarted the police for years. He admitted that Samantha was just the one who finally ended his streak. He told the agents they had only seen the tip of the iceberg, and that he had been doing this for a very long time. He began to draw maps, showing them exactly where to dig to find his hidden buckets of weapons and cash, finally revealing the scale of the monster they had captured. The interrogation of Israel Keyes became a grueling psychological marathon. He wouldn't talk unless he was given specific rewards: cigars, chocolate, or a certain brand of coffee. He treated the FBI agents not as enemies, but as students who were finally learning from a master. To prove he wasn't lying, he gave them coordinates. Agents were dispatched to remote areas in several states, and in every location, they found exactly what he described: Home Depot buckets filled with high-powered rifles, silencers, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. It was the physical proof of a man who had been at war with society for years. He was a prolific killer, and he wanted the agents to know exactly how much work he had put into his craft. But as the investigation moved forward, Israel's ego began to clash with the reality of the situation. He realized that as he gave up more information, he was losing his only remaining source of power. He started to toy with the investigators, giving them the names of states where he had committed murders, but refusing to provide the names of the victims or the locations of their bodies. He would laugh when they asked for more details, telling them that some secrets were for him alone. He wanted the world to know he was a legend in the dark, but he refused to give the families of his victims the closure they were desperate for. Even from behind bars, he was still playing the role of the predator, controlling the narrative until the very end. In December of 2012, the pressure of the upcoming trial and the realization that his secret life was about to be fully exposed to his family became too much for him to handle. On the night of December 2nd, Israel Keyes decided to take back the only thing he felt he still owned: his death. He had managed to hide a small piece of a razor blade inside his cell. He used it to cut his left wrist and then used a length of bedding he had fashioned into a ligature to ensure the job was finished. When the guards found him the next morning, he was gone. He left behind a suicide note that was a chilling 4-page poem titled Ode to Murder. It didn't contain an apology. It was a celebration of the darkness he had lived in for so long. Alongside the note, investigators found a piece of paper with 12 hand-drawn skulls, each one colored with his own blood. It is believed these skulls represented his victims, with the 12th representing himself. By taking his own life, Israel Keyes ensured that the full scale of his crimes would remain a mystery. The FBI spent years following up on his hunting trips, but without his guidance, many of his victims remain unidentified and unrecovered. He died exactly as he had lived, on his own terms, leaving behind a trail of silence and the unsettling truth that for years he had been exactly what he appeared to be: just another neighbor.